Chapter 1. Ugh, my brother is an infuriating, arrogant... Trevor Donovan yelled as he slammed down the telephone on his desk. Michael Bandy, one of Trevor's only friends at work, peeked his head into the office to see what the ruckus was about. "You okay, dude?" Trevor disliked being called dude, but he didn't want to insult Bandy. After all, he referred to the other man as Bandy, so he really didn't have any right to be indignant about his nickname. "No, I mean yes. Oh, hell, I don't know." Trevor ran his hand through his thick, jet-black hair as he stared out the window. Bandy walked in and shut the door behind him. "Spill," he instructed. "Trey is putting me in charge," Trevor revealed. "Of the Midwest Division? That's fantastic." Bandy sounded enthusiastic, but Trevor couldn't help wondering if his friend was really happy for him, or if there might be some heavily concealed envy in there somewhere. Bandy had been with Donovan Enterprises longer, and he had a better track record than Trevor. Nepotism was a real thing, and he knew most of his brother's employees wouldn't be at all thrilled to hear the news that he had just been given. "No, man." Trevor shook his head, still not quite believing it himself. "All of it." "All of it?" Bandy's head actually jerked back. "All of it?" He was having trouble comprehending what this meant. Trevor understood the confusion because he couldn't quite wrap his head around it either. "The whole empire," he finally clarified, mostly in the hopes of erasing the perplexed look from Bandy's face. "But he built this company from the ground up," Bandy started. "And he loves it. I've never seen a man more dedicated to his work." Trevor nodded, unable to argue with the accuracy of any of those statements. "What is he going to do?" "I think he's going to bake cupcakes for a year." Trevor flinched, even as he said the words. The entire conversation had been so out of character for his brother that he almost wondered if he was being pranked. "Cupcakes?" The one-word question was overflowing with disbelief. Bandy shook his head, obviously as confused as Trevor. "I guess." Trevor shrugged his shoulders, unsure what else to say. He didn't understand it either. His ruthless, workaholic brother was not the type to just hand over the reins of his billion-dollar company so he could go put on an apron and bake. It simply didn't make any sense. After a lengthy silence, Bandy finally said, "Wow." Trevor turned back to look at his friend then. He nodded his agreement with the assessment. Neither one of the men could quite comprehend it. "We're announcing it tomorrow, so keep it on the down low." "Sure, dude, no problem," Bandy promised jovially, already backing out of the office. "Well, good luck, and don't forget about us little people," Bandy added before walking out and reclosing the door behind him. Trevor already regretted telling the other man the news. He might as well have announced it over the office intercom system or sent a company-wide email. Bandy was such a gossip queen that he had probably already told everyone he passed in the hallway on the way back to his own office. Trey would be pissed if word leaked out before he had a chance to make an official statement. Taking a deep breath and dreading his brother's reaction, Trevor suddenly realized that Trey's reaction really didn't matter anymore. He was in charge now. Just the idea of it made his chest puff up a little bit. He was so used to obediently following his older brother's wishes that it had never occurred to him that he might someday be the one in the position of power. It was something that Trevor had always longed for, but never quite believed would actually happen. It was real, though. He was the boss, not Trey. The realization was shocking and liberating and frightening, all rolled into one big ball of delicious anxiety. What the hell was he supposed to do now? Chapter 2. The big announcement went by in a blur. If any Donovan Enterprises employees were offended by Trey's decision to leave Trevor in charge, he didn't catch wind of it. The only sentiments he heard from them were concerns about Trey's health and mindset. It was so out of character for Trey to take a leave of absence like this that it made people wonder what was truly going on. Trevor couldn't provide them any answers because his brother hadn't confided in him regarding the true reasoning for his abrupt departure. It felt larger than life to sit at his brother's desk. He felt like an imposter, as if he were a little kid sneaking into his father's office. Everything in Trey's space screamed power, from the imposing, almost regal chair to the massive windows and impressive balcony that looked out over the tiny minions far below. Trevor slowly sat down at the shiny mahogany desk and savored the powerful feeling of taking the helm of this empire. He had dreamed so many times of being in exactly this position, but he had never quite been able to convince himself that it would actually happen. The idea that his dominating, power-hungry brother would step down and let Trevor take over was almost inconceivable. He snapped forward from his relaxed position when Trey's, make that his, assistant, Millie, swished into the room. He couldn't keep the lustful look at bay as his gaze swept over the beautiful woman. She was so polished and professional, it made him wonder what it would be like when she let her golden blonde hair down from its smooth, tight chignon and had fun, if she ever did. Had she ever let her guard down and cut loose with Trey? The thought made his face pinch involuntarily. For some reason, he couldn't stand the thought of his brother being intimate with this gorgeous, brilliant, utterly amazing woman. Bringing him back to the present moment, Millie efficiently handed him a file containing contracts with color-coded arrow stickers marking the spots that required his signature, his agenda for the day, and a one-page brief on the company's holdings that summarized their latest moves on the stock market. They had taken a significant financial hit across the board since the announcement of Trey's departure, but that was to be expected. Trevor tried to quell the panic that threatened to rise up in his throat at the thought of ruining the empire his brother had worked so hard to build. He must have gone pale because Millie paused her monologue, seeming to see him for the first time. "It's going to be okay. We will bounce back," she promised, placing a reassuring hand over his. Her comforting touch felt marvelous, but all too quickly it was gone and she swished back out of the room, leaving only a faintly floral, delicious scent wafting in her wake. Trevor puffed out a breath and tried to focus on the papers she had presented to him. The numbers swirled before his eyes as he tried to make sense of it all. Running his fingers through his dark hair, he stared out the window, wondering if he was in way over his head. Just as his cell phone dinged with a reminder about a meeting, Millie appeared back in his office with a stack of neatly bound booklets. "It's almost time for the board meeting," she announced breezily. "Board meeting?" Trevor sat up so fast he nearly fell out of his chair. "Today?" he asked lamely, already having figured out the answer. "It was on your agenda." Her brow furrowed slightly as if she was uncertain how he could not have known. "I'm not ready," he said, hating having to admit to a failure already. "We have 15 minutes, she smiled confidently. "I'll brief you." She sat down on the edge of the deep, dark, brown leather couch, keeping her back perfectly straight, and indicated that he should join her. Once Trevor was settled beside her, Millie handed him a bulleted list of talking points. She then proceeded to familiarize him with the tabbed board book and his list of highlights. By the end of her monologue, he felt almost prepared, but he was still nervous. Sensing that he needed some reassurance, Millie stood and offered her hand to help him up. "I'll be right beside you," she promised, and somehow that gave him all the confidence that he needed to go face the dreaded board of directors. Chapter 3. He managed to wait until he was back in his office before letting the whoop of excitement escape from his lips. That was amazing. You were amazing. He lifted Millie into his arms and twirled her around, thrilled that her impeccable notes and presentation materials had made him look informed and prepared. She kept her body stiff as a board. You need to put me down, sir. This is highly inappropriate. Sir? He asked. That's my brother's name. I'm Trevor. Yes. Well, Trevor, nailing your presentation in that meeting was just the beginning of your day. You still have a lot of work to do. She pushed her snooty reading glasses higher up on her nose. The dark-rimmed glasses should have looked too prim and dorky, but on her, they just added to her sex appeal. The fact that the woman seemed to be all business made the thought of persuading her to relax, cut loose, and get naked seem nearly irresistible. She went on, clearly oblivious to the naughty turn his thoughts had taken. You have a meeting on the mall project in... She checked her wristwatch. 15 minutes. He was staring at her dainty, perfectly manicured hand, marveling at the fact that she still wore an actual watch, when she frowned at him. You are familiar with the mall project. Something about the terse way she had asked the question made him feel defensive. Of course, he lied. Good, she said, visibly relieved. I'd be really concerned about you filling in for Trey if you didn't know about it. She turned to leave, but he stopped her by yelling after her a little louder than he intended. Thank you. You were a lifesaver in that board meeting. Just doing my job, sir. She looked back at him and enunciated the use of the formality that he had asked her to drop. Then her lips turned up into a tiny, nearly imperceptible, ornery grin. When she sauntered out of his office, he could almost swear that there was an extra bit of sway to her delightful, curvy hips. This just keeps getting better and better. He leaned back in his chair and smiled to himself, beginning to feel comfortable in his new digs. Deciding he shouldn't take too long to bask, he sat up and scrambled through his papers from Millie to learn anything he could about the mysterious mall project his next meeting was about. He didn't discover much in his folder on the deal, probably because Millie assumed he was already familiar with it, but the meeting was only with a financier who was hoping to negotiate the deal for Donovan Enterprises, so Trevor decided that he would listen more than he talked. The mall meeting went smoothly, and he learned some vital pieces of information. The project involved a series of high-line outdoor malls. Signing the deal was Trey's top priority before he left, and Trey's arch-nemesis, Selena Chase, wasn't going to make this easy. Chapter 4. By the end of his first week, Trevor was absolutely exhausted. He honestly didn't know how his brother managed to do it all, but he was determined to keep up with the breakneck pace that Trey was known for. He decided to duck out a little early, at 6 p.m., since it was Friday night. He was just passing Millie's desk when she stopped him in his tracks. Do you have time to go home and change before the gala? Gala? He asked, realizing too late that he sounded like a clueless dope. It was on your agenda, she informed him in her no-nonsense tone. I can't. I'm not ready, he finally admitted. Opening one of her desk drawers, she poked around for a moment before pulling out a rolled-up, sleek silver tie. Lucky for you, I'm prepared for anything. She smiled as she handed him the necktie. He wondered what anything might entail. Some of the guests will be in tuxedos, but you can make a bold statement by showing up in this. It matches your suit perfectly, she assured him. I don't have a date, he muttered the thought out loud. Once people figure out who you are, a date will surely find you. She raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow at him. He wasn't used to the clamoring for attention that went along with his powerful new position, and he wasn't sure he ever would be. He shook his head, not wanting to attempt to slice through the fake, money-hungry groupies that always seemed to want to dig their long, red claws into Trey. Being his brother's proxy would likely mean they would now come after him. "Could you go with me?" He hated to use Millie as a crutch, but he always seemed to feel more comfortable when she was nearby. "That's not in my job description," she informed him. "I know. I just want you there for moral support." He added the last bit rather lamely. She seemed torn to the point that Trevor was convinced she was going to say no. Instead, she told him to give her a 15-minute head start before picking her up at her condo. "What's the address?" he asked her as she quickly grabbed her expensive leather handbag and bolted for the elevator. "Jim knows." She smiled at him as the doors closed, separating them. Trevor had forgotten that he now had a limo with a driver. That particular perk was especially difficult to get used to. He tried not to let it bother him as he pondered the fact that Jim had been to Millie's condo before. Did that mean that Trey had been there? Would it be against the rules to ask Jim? He had to assume that Jim's loyalties were with his brother, just like those of everyone else in his employ. That tough realization confirmed his first instinct, not to ask Jim any questions about Trey and Millie's relationship. He wasn't entirely sure that he wanted to know the answer anyway. Millie's 3-story condo was modern and picturesque. Just as Trevor was reaching for the car's door handle to climb out of the back of the limo, Millie emerged from her front door. Talk about picturesque. She was an absolute vision in a long, beaded, emerald green cocktail gown. Her blonde hair was still coiled into the French twist she often wore at work, but a few curly tendrils were now framing her lovely face. "You look stunning," Trevor informed her when she joined him in the limo. He didn't think it was possible for her to be more beautiful, but the rosy pink blush that surfaced on the apples of her cheeks proved him wrong. He lifted her hand to press his lips to it. When he set her hand back down, he tried to keep it clasped within his own, but she pulled away. "You're my boss," she reminded him simply, as if he had forgotten. "Acting boss," he amended, pulling a grin out of her. "I looked it up in the employee handbook, and it doesn't specifically mention acting bosses and employee relationships." "You did not look that up," she accused, but she couldn't seem to keep a straight face. "I did," he confirmed. "It's very clear that supervisor-employee relationships are forbidden, but we are definitely in a gray area as far as that goes." "Human resources wouldn't see it as a gray area," she informed him before adding, "and I'm the one who would lose my job. They can't afford to let you go." He couldn't deny the truth to her statement, so he decided to let the topic drop. The stretch limo was already pulling to a stop at the curb of the art museum where the gala was being held anyway. Quick as a wink, Jim was around the car and holding a large black umbrella out to protect his passengers from the misting rain that had just started falling. Unsure what to do and not wanting the chauffeur to feel like he had to accompany them inside, Trevor took the umbrella and told the driver he would text when they were ready to be picked up. Jim nodded and returned to his post. When Trevor placed a gentle hand on the small of Millie's back to lead her up the museum's wide marble steps, she didn't want to admit, even to herself, how good his warm palm felt on her lower back. She tried to convince herself that it was simply the kind gesture that had her skin tingling, but deep down, she knew there were definite sparks between her and her acting boss. She also knew that she had to put a stop to it or risk losing her job, something she wasn't willing to do. They both were astounded by the museum's transformation. The main hall had been turned into an elegant ballroom for the gala. The dimly lit statues and paintings served as the perfect backdrop for the event. Too nervous to eat, not wanting to drink, and unsure what else to do, the pair went straight to the silent auction tables. Trevor was embarrassed to discover his hefty six-figure salary was nothing compared to what most of his peers at this event earned. In fact, several of the silent auction bids for classic cars, fancy yachts, and extravagant private jets had already surpassed his annual salary. While his brother would have been the top dog if he were here, Trevor felt like an imposter who simply didn't belong. Not wanting Millie to catch wind of his shame, he asked her to dance. One thing he was confident in was his ballroom dancing skills. The smooth, graceful way she followed him seemed effortless, proving that she had plenty of her own talent on the dance floor. They glided and twirled together, gazing at each other as if they were the only two people in the room. When the song ended and several bystanders clapped for them, they realized that they had unwittingly been in the spotlight. Winded, they decided to step outside for some fresh air. Once there, Trevor offered her his suit jacket to stave off the chilly breeze. Thankfully, the misting had stopped, but it had left in its wake a briskness that hadn't been noticeable before. She gladly accepted his offered jacket, so he draped it over her shoulders. Availing himself of the opportunity, he left his arm around her. Despite her best intentions, she found herself sagging into his warmth, savoring the feeling of being protected by him as they looked out over the lights of the city. Their heads tipped together, leaning into each other. When Trevor turned to press his lips tenderly against the side of her forehead, she turned to look up at him. Her gaze was steady and adoring. It melted Trevor's heart. Before he knew what was happening, he had turned to face her and leaned down for a kiss on the lips. Her quiet moan when she opened her soft lips to his almost did him in. He kissed her hungrily, like a starving man aching for more. Their tongues found each other and danced together as their bodies had earlier. Arms embracing one another, they clung to this delicious, forbidden moment, not wanting it to ever end. Panting and craving him more than she had ever wanted anyone in her entire life, Millie forced herself to pull back. "We can't," she told him as her face crumpled. Lifting her palm to her mouth to catch a sob, she turned and ran back inside. "Damn it!" Trevor banged his fist down on the railing in a futile attempt to assuage his anger. Realizing that his outburst wasn't helping anything, he pulled out his cell phone and texted Jim that Millie was ready to be taken home. Deciding that he would just walk home, he shot off that text to Jim as well. Maybe the fresh air would help clear his head enough that he could figure out what to do about the woman of his dreams, who also happened to be his employee. Chapter 5. It was an incredibly long weekend. Trevor had never before looked forward to Monday morning. He couldn't wait to see Millie and attempt to make her feel better about their budding relationship. He had texted and called her several times, but she hadn't answered. Even though he was certain that if he contacted her about work, she would have immediately responded. He didn't want to trick her into talking to him. He had considered driving over to her condo and banging on the door, but finally decided that if she wanted to hear from him, she would have answered her phone. Rather than beating down her door, he had thrown himself into work. The office was quieter on the weekend, so it was a good time for him to learn as much as he could about in-flight projects. The neatly filed, color-coded folders reminded him of Millie, but he tried not to think about her too much as he digested every detail he could about the deals Trey had brewing before he left the helm of this massive ship. He couldn't deny that he had secretly hoped that Millie would come into the office over the weekend to get a little extra work done, but that didn't happen. He tried telling himself he was glad to not have the distraction of her being so perfect and poised right outside his office, but he knew that in reality, he'd give about anything to see her. After getting a few hours of shut-eye, He jumped out of bed and into the shower early on Monday morning. He planned to be there when Millie arrived. Maybe he'd even stop and get her one of those fancy cappuccinos she loved to sip. The fact that he remembered what she liked might help convince her that he was suitable boyfriend material, even though he was her boss at the moment. He shook his head at the unlikelihood of that ever happening. He'd only known Millie a short while, but one thing he was certain of was that she liked to play by the rules. Unfortunately for him, dating one's boss, or acting boss, was definitely against the rules. After picking up 2 Cinnamon Crunch bagels with cream cheese, black coffee for himself, and Millie's sugary brew of choice, he rode the elevator to the top floor of Donovan Enterprises, his building. He liked the sound of that and wasn't sure if the grin that surfaced on his face was from that thought or the knowledge that he would get to see Millie soon. He was mildly disappointed that Millie wasn't already at her desk, clacking away at her keyboard so fast that her fingers nearly blurred. He knew it was a long shot for her to already be in, since it was so early, but it hadn't kept the hope of seeing her from creeping in. After depositing the surprise treats for her on her tidy desk, he went to his office to get some early morning correspondence done. Even though he had worked yesterday, his computer indicated that there were already 5 voicemails on his phone line. He was pleasantly surprised when he reached the 3rd message and Millie's lovely, lilting voice came through the speaker. When he heard what she had to say, he nearly slammed the phone down in frustration. "No!" he shouted to the empty room before ending the call without bothering to listen to the last 2 messages. Millie had called in sick. Her reputation for always being reliable, poised, and prepared was well known throughout the company. She never called in sick. Ever. If she wasn't coming into the office today, it was because of him. The realization made his stomach feel queasy. Millie was a strictly by-the-book person, and he had tempted her into crossing the line into forbidden territory. The guilt must be eating away at her. He had to go talk to her and convince her that their situation was not her fault. If he had to promise never to touch her again in order to get her to come back to work, that was what he would do, even though it would practically kill him. He cared about her enough to let her go if that was what she needed. Besides, she was vital to the operation of the business. He couldn't risk losing her. He would be lost without her. He would just have to learn to live with the temptation of being near her all day without being able to express his true feelings for her. Wishing he had his own car, he texted Jim to let him know he needed to be picked up downstairs. It was embarrassing to give the chauffeur the address of where he was going, but Jim was a complete professional. He simply nodded his acknowledgement and went about his job of delivering Trevor to his destination. One thing Trevor had to give his older brother credit for was finding the best employees to keep close by his side. He didn't want to ruin that in his first weeks of filling in for Trey, so it was vital that he convince Millie to come back during this visit. His palms were clammy as he made a fist and pounded on her door. It was still early, but he knew she was up since she had already called his desk phone. The realization that she probably called in the middle of the night so she wouldn't have to risk talking to him didn't help with his already frazzled nerves. He didn't have to stress about it for too long because he heard her door unlocking and a chain sliding free before the door opened a crack. Millie was standing back in the shadows as if she were afraid of him. He had already told Jim that he could leave. He would hate to have to immediately text the driver for a ride back to the office, alone, but it was beginning to feel like a distinct possibility. "Are you okay? I got your message and wanted to check on you." He tried to lean in to get a better look at her, but she was holding the door firmly in place. "I'm fine," she answered, but her voice didn't sound fine. He didn't believe her for a second. "Please let me in." He waited for what seemed to be an interminable amount of time. Just when he was beginning to think she might actually turn him away, she sighed and opened the door wider. That is when he saw the gel ice pack she was holding up to her cheek near her hairline. "What happened?" he asked, shocked by seeing the woman he cared about be in obvious pain. "It's nothing." She tried to brush the injury off like it didn't matter. Fury and rage immediately formed a hot mixture that raced through his veins. "Who did this to you? I'll kill him!" Seeing Millie look vulnerable brought out his naturally protective nature. "No, it's nothing like that," Millie reassured him as she gave up keeping him out of her home and went over to rest on the couch, leaving the door ajar. Following her inside, Trevor sat down on the edge of the couch and placed her calves across his lap. When Millie adjusted the ice pack on her cheek, he noticed the scrapes on her elbow. "What the hell happened?" He reached out gingerly to examine her injuries. "I fell," she said simply. He wasn't buying that. There was more to the story, he could tell. If she was protecting some loser boyfriend that had hurt her, Trevor thought he really might murder the other man. He couldn't bear the thought of anyone raising a hand to her in anger. "How about the truth this time?" He lifted his dark, slashing brows at her, hoping that he was mimicking his brother's menacing look that told others he meant business. She sighed and looked down. He knew that this time he would get the truth. "I was attacked by a goose, okay?" "I'm sorry, what?" Trevor had heard her, but he was stalling and trying to keep from smiling, both with relief that another man hadn't hurt her, and at the visual of a goose chasing after her. Unable to hide the smile, Millie saw it and reached forward to smack his shoulder playfully. "It's not funny, it really hurt." She tried to pout, but she was grinning too. Before she knew it, they were both laughing. "I'll shoot it for you," Trevor offered. "No!" Millie gasped. "He was just protecting his family. They have a nest on the roof of my carport." "Well, isn't there a maintenance crew that could have the nest moved or something?" he asked logically. "Oh, no," Millie shook her head adamantly. "Did you know that geese come back to the same place every year to make their nest? Oh, and that they mate for life?" She had a dreamy expression that led Trevor to believe that even after being attacked, she wasn't going to do anything about these geese. She confirmed that guess when she added, "I'll just park somewhere else until the goslings have hatched and they have moved on." He shook his head at her. "I never would have guessed that you were such a romantic, Miss Parks." Her cheeks blushed that beautiful shade of rosy pink that he so enjoyed. He really looked at her then. He had been so focused on her injuries that he hadn't taken notice that her long, blonde hair was down. It fell in shiny, soft waves that he longed to touch. Rather than her all-business attire, she was sporting a faded Red Sox t-shirt and baggy gray sweatpants. Although she didn't have on a scrap of makeup, her complexion was flawless, except for the goose injuries. She looked relaxed and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. When his eyes finally traveled down to her feet, he almost laughed out loud. Each toenail was polished a different, brightly colored, sparkly hue. Her toes formed a happy rainbow of color. She wiggled them at him when she noticed him checking them out. "They make me happy," she admitted. "You are full of surprises. No one would ever guess that all of this vivacious color lurks underneath those sleek, classic, all-business heels you wear at work." He shook his head, marveling at her. "If you think that is a surprise, you should see my undergarments," she quipped. His throat suddenly felt dry. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he swallowed and croaked out the word, "Okay." Her flirtatious hint was all the invitation he needed. He leaned in and took her mouth with his. He wanted to claim her as his own. She met him and matched him move for move, claiming him instead. The ice pack dropped, long forgotten. She straddled him on the couch as they kissed hungrily. He raked his fingers through her long, glorious hair and discovered it was as silky as he had imagined. When she pulled back to gaze into his dark eyes, they were both panting with need. His phone took that inopportune moment to ding at him with an appointment reminder. They both knew exactly what the sound was. She slumped over him. "You have somewhere you need to be," she said sadly. "It's okay," he tried. "I can blow it off." Not one to be so easily deterred, Millie grabbed her phone and scrolled through his schedule. "It's the meeting with the lawyers and accountants about the mall deal. You can't miss that. Trey would be furious." Trevor rolled his eyes as she climbed off him, the moment ruined. There was Trey again, getting in the middle of everything. It was so frustrating and annoying. For once in his life, Trevor wanted to stand up to his brother and refused to give in to him about everything, but today evidently wasn't going to be that day. Millie was already at her door, ushering him out. "Come on, you don't want to be late." "Actually, I do," he tried, but she wasn't putting up with any of his nonsense. She turned her uninjured cheek to him when he leaned in for a kiss. "I texted Jim for your pickup," she yelled after him as he was walking down her sidewalk and searching for his blasted phone. He didn't even bother to ask how she had accomplished that so quickly. The woman was simply amazing. Too bad she worked for him. Chapter 6. The meeting did not go well. Apparently, Selena Chase, Trey's only real competition, was playing hardball with the mall deal. Since he knew that this deal was Trey's baby, Trevor wasn't about to let it slide through his fingers. He missed having Millie in the office. She would have slipped him talking points or other key data to better prepare him for the meeting. She also would have unobtrusively poked her head in, somehow sensing the best time to bring beverages, lunch, or whatever else was needed. She seemed to have some sort of sixth sense that allowed her to be the ideal assistant, and he just plain missed getting to see her lovely face. Even with an injured cheek, she was still absolutely beautiful. Candace, the woman filling in for Millie, was basically just a receptionist. When Trevor had gone out to her desk to request that she bring a coffee carafe to the executive boardroom, something Millie would have already taken care of, Candace had been filing her fingernails. It was so unprofessional that he had almost asked her to leave, but stopped himself because he realized that most of his problem with her was the simple fact that she was not Millie. By the time the meeting ended, Trevor was fairly certain that Selena Chase was going to steal this deal right out from under his nose. She wasn't playing fair. His advisors informed him that she had been meeting with every member of the Donovan Enterprises team that she could sink her claws into in order to offer them more money, a better title, whatever it was that they most desired. Key employees were beginning to drop like flies, and they were taking inside information with them. The latest traitor was Trevor's only friend from downstairs, Bandy. He wondered what secrets his friend was sharing with the competition. That man blabbed everything he knew. The fact that Trey had insisted on trusting his people and refusing to make them sign confidentiality agreements was now beginning to burn the company. Each move they made, Selena was one step ahead of them, undercutting them. The realization that she might actually secure the entire deal made his head pound with anxiety. He paced back and forth when he got back to his office. "This can't be happening. I can't lose this deal." He stared out the large windows as he muttered to himself. He longed to talk to Millie. She would know what to do. As if sensing that he needed her, his phone buzzed with a text from her. When he read what it said, he nearly threw the device across the room. Rather than text her back, he decided to call her. He started speaking as soon as she answered. "What do you mean we can't see each other anymore?" His voice sounded harsher and more demanding than he intended. "Trevor, you're my boss," she replied rationally. I enjoy spending time with you, but it is inappropriate for us to have anything more than a professional relationship." "What if I wasn't your boss?" he asked. She was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint and filled with disbelief. "You would fire me?" "No," he responded immediately. "I would step down and let my brother find someone else to stand at the helm of his empire." "You can't do that." Her voice sounded much steadier now. "This is what you've always wanted." "I want you more," he told her honestly. "That's sweet, but I can't let you give up on your dream. You can do this." She sounded far more confident than he felt. Hesitating for a moment to take a deep breath, she finally added, "Selena Chase called me today." Trevor could hear the blood rushing in his ears. "You can't leave Donovan Enterprises. We need you." He could barely hear his own words over the pounding in his head, so he went with the simple truth. "It would solve our employee-boss relationship problem," she started before adding under her breath, "or create new problems." Trevor figured it would be the latter, but he let her finish. "I told her never to call me again because I have no intentions of ever leaving Donovan Enterprises." Trevor let out a breath that he hadn't realized he was holding. "I guess I can add loyalty to the ever-growing list of things to love about you." She giggled at his compliment, and he basked in the sound of it. He pictured her relaxed and casual look of sweatpants, fluffy hair, and bare feet with their surprise pop of color, and silently vowed to figure this out. After saying goodbye to Millie, Trevor made a decision. It was time to go pay his brother a visit. Chapter 7. The ostentatious, long black limo was completely out of place in the quaint town where his brother was hiding. Trevor had to assume that Trey looked just as misplaced as his gaudy car. What his shark of a businessman brother was doing in this one-stoplight town was beyond him. It felt a little like tucking tail and admitting defeat to come here to seek his brother's counsel, but he would rather do that than risk losing it all. He had learned long ago that it was better to admit a little bit of weakness early in the game than to hide it and let it snowball into something uncontrollable. His brother would never forgive him if he lost the mall deal, and he would never forgive himself if he lost Millie. The limo slid smoothly to a stop in front of a tiny bakery that seemed to be booming with business. Trevor chuckled at the sign, which proclaimed the name of the establishment in curvy pastel letters which almost looked like a child's writing, Snickerdoodle. It was cute, almost too cute. He couldn't believe his brother had even set foot in the place, let alone completely set up shop here. Trevor got in line and secretly watched the two women behind the counter. It didn't take more than a few seconds to discern which one of them was Trey's love interest. They were both attractive, but the one with red hair was too bold, loud, and flirtatious for his brother's taste. The neon green shirt she wore under her apron was so bright it almost hurt his eyes. The understated elegance of the beautiful blonde one was much more Trey's style. She gave each of her customers a friendly smile, asked a personalized question that displayed her attention to details about them while she filled their order, then efficiently checked them out and moved to the next patron. She had a natural way about her that made each of her customers feel important and like they were the only person that mattered to her, even as she shuffled them along and out the door. It was truly a rare gift. He enjoyed watching her so much that he was almost disappointed when he made his way to the front of the line. His disappointment increased when the red-haired woman with the coral lipstick that had been applied with a heavy hand beamed at him. "Hi," the woman practically shouted, leaning in to give him a long view of her ample cleavage. "What can I get you?" she breathed out flirtatiously. He had been planning to order something just to see how the blonde would engage with him, but since Red was waiting on him, he jumped straight to the reason for his visit. "I need to see Trey," he told her simply. The blonde darted her gaze in his direction. The concerned look in her eyes let him know that she was a protective mama bear when it came to his brother's privacy. The redhead looked to the other woman for guidance. She was clearly uncertain if she should give out any details about Trey. The blonde handed her customer a white paper bag filled with soft-baked goodies, gave him a warm smile, and wished him luck with his car repair. The man responded, "Yeah, I hope Rusty doesn't try to take me to the cleaners again." She laughed, waved goodbye, and then turned to Trevor, suddenly all business. "Is there something I can help you with?" The cool shift in her demeanor was unmistakable. There was suddenly no doubt in Trevor's mind that the woman, whose name tag proclaimed her name to be Ellie, was in Trey's corner, watching his back. He liked knowing that Trey had found someone that he could trust completely. It was a rare gift for someone with so much money and power. Extending his hand over the counter to shake hers, he introduced himself. "Trevor Donovan." The transformation of Ellie's face from leery suspicion to open friendliness was almost immediate. She ignored his offered hand, opting instead to run around the counter for a warm embrace. "Trevor, it's wonderful to put a face to the brother that Trey speaks so highly of." Trevor felt an unsettling bubble of anxiety at the realization that Trey would not be at all pleased when he found out that Trevor was on the verge of losing the mall deal, to Selena Chase of all people. And that was the good news. He was certain that his feelings for Millie would not be a welcome announcement, but he needed to fess up to Trey before things went too far. Oblivious to his inner turmoil, Ellie pulled back and grasped his hand to lead him behind the counter. "Trey is going to be so excited to see you," she enthused. Doubting that, but seeing no alternative but to go with her, Trevor followed Ellie as she practically skipped back to the bakery's kitchen. The sight of his brother practically floored Trevor. He was used to seeing Trey in perfectly tailored suits, so the vision of him in jeans, a gray t-shirt, and the flour-dusted red apron that proclaimed "Real Men Bake" was shocking. Trevor bugged his eyes out, drinking in the sight before him, not quite able to believe what he was seeing. Trey's eyes lit up when he spotted his brother. "Trevor!" He opened his arms, hugging his brother for the first time since they had been forced to make up after fighting as children. Trevor discreetly swiped the flour from his suit after his brother's embrace as Trey gushed, "It's so great to see you." Without pausing for a breath, he added, "You have to taste my latest cupcake recipe." "Cupcake recipe?" Trevor asked numbly, unable to equate the man before him with the business mogul brother he had been expecting to see. While he was still trying to process, Trey shoved an admittedly delicious-looking cupcake under his nose. Seeing no alternative except to taste the blasted thing, Trevor took a bite, even though he only wanted to share the reason for his visit with his brother. Distracted by the warm, delicious flavor assaulting his taste buds, he said, "That's wonderful." "You sound surprised." His brother gave him a playful shove to the shoulder before biting into a cupcake of his own. Enjoying this new playful side of Trey, Trevor ventured, "You're eating a lot of baked goods, aren't you? Someone might start to go soft around the middle." As soon as he said it, he wondered if he had gone too far. Trey eased his worries by grabbing Ellie, assuring Trevor that he had plenty of ways to work off the extra calories, then dipping her back for a passionate kiss. Trevor felt uneasy at the open display of affection. Trey had never been one to go crazy over a woman, until now, apparently. When they didn't come up for air, Trevor finally cleared his throat to let them know it was becoming awkward to stand there watching them make out. Trey finally, and rather reluctantly, pulled back and settled Ellie back on her feet. She at least had the decency to blush over their loss of control. His brother just beamed at him, looking giddily happy and having no shame. "We need to talk business," Trevor informed him, shooting a dismissive glance at Ellie. Trey caught the look and said sternly, "Ellie can hear anything you have to say." Ellie smoothed things over by saying, "I need to get back up front anyway." "I'll fill you in later," Trey promised her before pulling the back of her hand up to press his lips against it. "I'll miss you," he added sappily as she sauntered dreamily back to the storefront. Trevor caught himself just before rolling his eyes. It was so odd to see his brother madly in love. Wanting to get down to business, he asked, "You want the bad news or the worst news first?" Sitting down at the card table that served as a break room and ushering Trevor to the other chair, Trey answered, "Start with the bad, I guess." "I am falling for Millie," Trevor told him without further preamble. If Trey was surprised by the announcement, he hid it quickly. "And that's a bad thing because she's your assistant. Well, my assistant," he amended. "She works for us and she does a damn good job, but relationships between someone with a position of power and an employee are strictly forbidden. It's in the company handbook. I looked it up," he gushed. "You looked it up in the handbook?" Trey raised one thick, dark eyebrow in his brother's direction. Seeing Trevor's affirmative nod and the pathetic look on his face made Trey turn serious. "Is Millie open to a relationship?" he asked. "She would be, but she doesn't want to lose her job." Trevor tried to keep the whiny tone out of his voice. It was an impossible situation, so he wasn't sure what he expected his older brother to do about it. "If the two of you have a fling and things don't work out, will you fire her?" Trey's piercing, hawk-like gaze rested on his brother. He looked more like the imposing man Trevor was used to dealing with than the happy baker he had first encountered in the kitchen. "Of course not!" Trevor was insulted by the insinuation. "Would you demote her?" Trey continued along those lines, even though his brother was obviously becoming agitated. "No," Trevor answered firmly. Deciding to stop this conversation in its tracks, he added, "Millie and I are both professionals. We would continue to work together despite any awkward feelings over our personal relationship." "Then I'm not seeing what the problem is," Trey stated matter-of-factly over his folded hands. "Human resources, the handbook, rules?" Trevor spluttered. "You are in charge now. You make the rules." Trey sat forward in his chair and pointed a finger at his brother as he spoke. "So change them if you want to," he added as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I'm sure the rules are there for a reason," Trevor responded logically. "What if we get sued?" "What if we do?" Trey raised his shoulders. "We'll deal with it. Next issue." He almost sounded bored by these problems that had been eating away at Trevor. Trevor blinked several times in an attempt to comprehend that Trey had just given him permission to date Millie. Scratch that. He didn't actually need permission from anyone to see her because he could make the rules now. The fact that he was the one in charge finally began to sink in, and his chest puffed up involuntarily. The realization was both liberating and enlightening. He had assumed that his brother would keep tight reins on everything important, even during this sabbatical. The proof that he was truly trusting Trevor and stepping back was exhilarating, if a little frightening. This next revelation would be a true test. He doubted his brother would be able to keep his fingers out of this one, and to be honest, he wouldn't mind having Trey rescue him just this once. Taking a deep breath, he admitted, "We are losing the mall deal to Selena Chase." His brother narrowed a dark-eyed stare at him, taking a few deep breaths of his own. When he finally spoke, his words were not at all what Trevor had expected to hear. "Let's go for a walk," Trey suggested. Chapter 8. Stunned, Trevor saw no alternative except to follow his brother outside. It was a gorgeous, sunny day, and Trey seemed perfectly content to stroll along at a snail's pace, basking in the warm rays beaming down on his face, and completely ignore the bombshell his brother had just dropped on him. Frustrated with Trey's level of calmness, Trevor spluttered. "Did you hear me? We are getting ready to lose the mall deal to Selena Chase." He added the last words for emphasis, trying to get some type of reaction out of this stranger that looked vaguely like his power-hungry business mogul brother. "Here's the town's library." Trey completely ignored his brother's tantrum. "It used to be a bank, but I bought the building and had it refurbished. The books are from a brick-and-mortar bookstore that closed down thanks to Amazon's domination of the book market. It's really a gem, isn't it?" Trevor couldn't get over the look of pride in his brother's eyes as he talked about this podunk little library. It was hard to believe that this was the same man known for forging multi-million-dollar deals over lunch. "Yeah, I guess," Trevor finally responded, since his brother seemed to be waiting for an answer. Not seeming to sense Trevor's lack of enthusiasm about the town improvements he was implementing, Trey continued on his meandering walk. "See this ice cream shop? It was an abandoned gas station until I got a hold of it." He beamed with pride. "They have the best gelato this side of the Mississippi," he bragged. "Come on." Trevor allowed himself to be dragged inside the rustic ice cream shop, even though he couldn't help muttering under his breath, "Didn't you just eat a cupcake?" Trey must have heard the dig because he said, "Life is short. You might as well enjoy it." With a naughty grin, he added, "Besides, Ellie will help me work it off later." Trevor inwardly cringed at his brother's insinuation, but didn't comment about how out of character it was for him to share such details. Since Trey insisted, Trevor sat down with a large cup of Italian chocolate chip gelato. He did have to admit it was rather tasty, but it wasn't something he would have ever dreamed his brother would focus his attention on. "So, back to the mall project," he started, hoping to force his brother to concentrate on what mattered. Seeming to completely ignore the nudge, Trey stared out towards the ornamental antique gas pumps in front of the shop as he said, "Do you know why this town improvement project is going so well?" He pretended not to hear his brother's frustrated sigh, instead opting to answer his own question. "It's because I'm focusing on one piece at a time. I don't look at it as one big project. Rather, I spend all of my energy on getting one piece right before moving on to the next. Like a puzzle." Trey seemed lost in thought as he prattled on. "The owner of this property," he waved his arms around encompassing the gas station turned ice cream shop, "didn't want to sell to me. I just had to find something that he did want. Turned out that was my Porsche." "You sold your Porsche?" Trevor bugged his eyes out at the man sitting across from him. That classic, refurbished, pristine car had been his brother's baby. Trey simply shrugged his shoulders. "I did what it took to make the deal." He turned a more familiar, steely gaze toward his brother then. "Does that make sense?" And suddenly, it did. Chapter 9. Trevor called Millie from his limo on the way back to Donovan Enterprises. His visit with his brother had been more uplifting, surprising, and helpful than he ever would have imagined, and now he had a plan. Millie crisply agreed to all of his instructions, even though she was still at home recuperating from her goose attack. Promising to handle all of his requests, she signed off the phone to get busy. Trevor's first stop upon returning to the office was the human resources floor. The workers in the hallway gawked at him as he walked through on his way to the Vice President of People Services corner office. Even though the woman had a meeting in progress in her office, she excused the others and smiled warmly at Trevor. It was an odd, heady feeling to know that he was the most powerful person in the building. The VP bugged her eyes out at Trevor's request, but nodded her head in acknowledgement. If she had any concerns about his proposed changes, she kept them to herself. Feeling on top of the world, Trevor went home to pack. He figured he would be gone for several weeks because he wasn't coming home until he had the mall deal finalized. His first meeting was with a slick-looking developer in Los Angeles. It was a tough sell. Selena Chase had already been to see him, and the money she was offering for the land they needed was already a hefty sum. Trevor sat back assessing the other man. He had spent the evening talking to him and watching him schmooze and flirt with every attractive person, male or female, who walked past their table. Trevor had already tried hardball negotiation, sweet-talking, and just about every other tactic he could think of, but the man wasn't budging. Trevor refused to flirt with him because he was concerned about where the other man might want that to lead. Finally, he just asked him straight up, "What is it that you want?" The man paused with his glass of scotch halfway to his mouth. At first, he seemed taken aback by the brash question, but then he beamed a too bright white smile at Trevor. Leaning in, he said, "Rumor has it that your brother has a Picasso." Now we're talking. Trevor had no trouble negotiating the deal after that, and the two men shook hands on it. Later that night, Trevor reflected on the win. It was fun being a wheeler and dealer. He hoped that his brother wouldn't be angry that he had traded his painting, but the lesson he had gleaned from his visit to Trey was that his brother wanted him to do whatever it took to make the deal. That is exactly what he was doing, and he had to admit, it was a blast. He spent the next several weeks flying around the country, making deals one by one. He focused on really listening to the people on the other side of the contract to find out what they wanted, and then figuring out a way to get it for them. One of the most challenging deals was for some farmland just outside of Kansas City. The farmer, Mark, wanted to increase his land size, not sell it. Trevor proceeded to meet with all of the local farmers to work deals for their plots. He ended up finding several that were willing to sell. When he presented Mark with the package that nearly doubled his current acreage, the man actually had tears in his eyes. When Trevor went to shake his hand, the farmer pulled him into a bear hug, slapping him on the back and insisting that he come home with him for dinner. The ham, mashed potatoes, corn, green beans, buttermilk biscuits, and peach cobbler were by far the best meal he had eaten in a long time. Even the most fancy restaurant couldn't compete with a homemade country meal. By the time he left the homestead that evening, he felt like a part of Mark's family. Day by day and deal by deal, Trevor worked to secure each piece of the whole package on the mall deal. With each signature, he required a confidentiality clause that would keep Selena Chase from finding out early and swooping in to steal the deal back from Donovan Enterprises. He traveled the country, getting to know the real people behind the numbers and helping to make their dreams come true in exchange for another piece of the puzzle. Even though he was using the company's luxurious private jet and he was staying in swanky hotels, he was getting tired and felt ready to go home. His daily check-in calls with Millie were all business, and he was starting to become concerned that she no longer had feelings for him. He couldn't stand the thought of losing her, but he needed to finish these negotiations before heading home. The last meeting was going to be his most challenging. Trey had envisioned the Atlanta Mall as the franchise's flagship, but the land they needed was owned by Selena Chase's mentor, Grant Wiltshire. Trevor was surprised the man had even agreed to meet with him. The meeting was at Grant's estate. It was a classic positioning tactic. Make the enemy come to your turf. In another play for power, Grant made Trevor wait for him. The butler had seated him outside by the infinity pool, so Trevor decided to enjoy the time, refusing to take the bait and get annoyed by his host's tardiness. When the older gentleman did arrive, he looked like someone who had been chosen for the role by central casting. His imposing height, bushy eyebrows, and white puff of hair made him appear more like an angry hawk than an aging businessman.
"Why should I even talk to you?"
was the terse way he greeted Trevor.
"You shouldn't,"
Trevor responded honestly.
"But we're here, so we might as well eat, right?"
Something about his frank response must have impressed the old man because he bellowed with surprisingly loud laughter before responding,
"Well, I suppose so,"
and tucking into the plate of chicken salad and fruit that had been placed before him. They ate in silence. Trevor followed the other man's lead, waiting patiently for the right moment to talk. Once their cherry cheesecake dessert was served, Grant took a sip of his steaming black coffee and said,
"Selena will never forgive me if I sell to you."
"I understand," Trevor nodded, accepting the man's answer and scooting back his chair.
"Where do you think you're going?" the older man grouched. "She'll never forgive me, but that stubborn woman doesn't know what's in her own best interest. Maybe one of these days, she'll figure out that I did it for her."
Did what? Trevor was beginning to dare to hope the man meant that he would sell to him, but he couldn't quite bring himself to believe it.
"I'm not going to sign the damn papers if you ask any more idiotic questions like that."
The old man frowned at him.
"Okay,"
Trevor chuckled, trying to keep the glee out of his voice. He knew this must be a difficult decision for the other man, so he kept the whoop of excitement curtailed until he was securely ensconced back in the privacy of his rental car. He considered calling Trey, but the first person's name that his finger tapped was Millie's. He couldn't wait to share the news with her. After all, she had worked for this deal as much as anyone. But when she answered the phone, business quickly left his mind because Millie was sobbing. Chapter 10.
"What's wrong?"
He felt panicked that Millie was obviously so upset. He could barely understand her response through the sobs and hiccups.
"Goose ran over. Babies won't have a daddy. Mate for life."
He picked enough out of the garbled conversation to realize that the goose that had attacked her had been injured. Relief coursed through him that it wasn't something catastrophic. The fact that it was so important to her made it important to him, though. She was normally the calm, composed one who logically thought about any problem and devised a plan. Since she was so upset, he would step into that role for her. "Is the animal still alive?" he asked calmly.
"I don't know,"
she wailed into the phone.
"It's all right. Sit tight. I'll send help, and I'm on my way there," he promised.
Okay," she sniffled, seeming uncertain how to react to someone else taking care of her for once.
"Everything will work out, I promise,"
he told her before disconnecting. Once the line was dead, he silently vowed to keep that promise, even though he had no idea how to do so. Who did one call to help an injured goose? This was the type of thing that Millie would normally effortlessly take care of, but she was in no shape to handle it now. Deciding that this was silly, he was a fill-in billionaire after all. He looked up the number for the veterinarian's office that he passed each day on his way to work and dialed them. When he told the receptionist his problem, she responded that the doctor didn't make house calls or work on geese. He informed her in his most authoritative voice,
"She'll need to make an exception for this goose. It's special."
Almost as an afterthought, he added,
"She can name her price. This is Trevor Donovan from Donovan Enterprises."
It was the first time he had thrown his name around to get his way. Apparently, those were the magic words because the receptionist changed her tune. "She's in with a patient right now, Mr. Donovan, but I'll go knock on the door." With minimal coaxing, he was able to secure a goose doctor. He just prayed that the dumb animal was still alive. Chapter 11. As they readied the company jet for takeoff, Trevor joked with Julie, his personal flight attendant, whom he had gotten to know fairly well as they jetted across the country these past few weeks.
"If you could ask the pilot to fly fast, I'd appreciate it. I have an injured goose waiting on me at home."
Julie furrowed her brows in confusion, but she was too professional and well-trained to question anything her clients proclaimed. She opted instead to smile, promise to see what she could do, and offer him a sparkling water. Kicking back, he decided to rest while he could. This might turn out to be a long night. Right after landing, he asked Jim to deliver him straight to the vet's office. As soon as he walked into the nearly empty office, Millie rushed into his arms. "Donald is in surgery," she told him sadly.
"Donald?"
Trevor pulled back to look at her. Even distraught with worry, she was impossibly beautiful. "I named them Donald and Daisy," she told him seriously.
"Aren't those ducks?"
Seeing her sad face made him regret the question as soon as he uttered it. It really didn't matter what she called them, and it wasn't the moment to be giving her a hard time.
"Come here,"
he said, placing a comforting arm around her shoulder and guiding her to sit down beside him on the floral print love seat in the dated waiting room. They waited and waited. The office was quiet because it was well after their regular hours. Trevor assumed that it was not a good sign that it was taking so long, but he didn't mention that concern to Millie. She was already worried enough. Instead, he decided to put a positive spin on it.
"He must be alive, or they wouldn't still be in there," he tried to reassure her.
She nodded, but continued to wring her hands together. He wasn't sure what else to say. He hated feeling so useless. It was amazing how quickly he went from being on top of the world negotiating multi-million-dollar deals to sitting in a waiting room worrying over a stupid goose's health. Except it wasn't a stupid goose. The animal mattered to Millie, which made it important to him. After what seemed like an eternity, the veterinarian emerged from the back. They both stood up and waited with bated breath for her to update them.
"We need to monitor him closely for the next 24 hours, but he survived the surgery and is stable. That is one strong goose." She smiled through her exhaustion.
Millie sagged with relief at the news. Trevor used his arm around her shoulders to support her. When the other woman turned to leave, Millie stepped forward. "Doctor?" When she turned back, Millie pulled the surprised woman into a warm hug. "Thank you so much," she gushed. The vet patted her back kindly before pulling away.
"He is a lucky goose to have you two on his side. Now go home and get some rest."
With that, she was gone. Jim was waiting outside. Trevor suddenly felt selfish for not thinking to tell the driver he could leave. He had been so frantic in his rush to meet Millie, he hadn't thought of this simple kindness. The man seemed completely unperturbed by the long wait and quickly whisked them to Millie's condo upon Trevor's request. Millie leaned against Trevor's shoulder and finally allowed herself to doze off. Her tiny puffs of breath near his ear raised the tiny hairs at the back of his neck. He loved it that she felt safe enough in his arms to sleep. When she began to snore lightly, he grinned to himself. Just when he thought this woman couldn't get any more adorable, she proved him wrong. All too quickly, they pulled to a stop in front of her sidewalk. Jim moved to get the car doors for them, but Trevor told him to stay put. The man simply nodded and continued facing forward, a consummate professional. Trevor opened the door beside him and slowly scooted out, using his hands to support Millie as she slept. When he slid his arms under her to ease her out of the car, he quickly discovered that she was light as a feather. When she stirred as he settled her in his arms, he pressed a kiss down on her soft hair, and she rested back against his chest. When he got to her front door, he realized the problem with his master plan to swoop her inside. He didn't have the entry code. Seeming to sense his problem despite her groggy state, she mumbled, "It's not locked." Her words concerned him, but he used his right hand to release the latch, while his arm continued to support her legs under her knees. Kicking the door open, he couldn't keep from asking, "Why isn't your door locked?" "I was so frantic when I heard the noise outside when Donald got hit that I rushed out there. Daisy was so upset. Luckily my cell phone was in my pocket or I wouldn't have gotten your call." Her explanation made sense, but he was still concerned about leaving her in a condo that had been unlocked all day. When he asked where her bedroom was, she answered that it was upstairs without questioning his motives. As he carried her up the stairs, he tried not to think about the fact that he would be in her bedroom soon. "Do you know who hit Donald?" he asked, in an attempt to distract himself from the naughty thoughts that were echoing around his brain. "No, they drove off without even checking on him. It almost makes me think it was intentional. He's kind of aggressive, but he's just trying to protect his family," she said, jumping to her winged attacker's defense. When Trevor promised to check with the condo association to see if they had any video security surveillance that he could use to figure out who had done this, she tipped up to kiss his cheek. "My hero," she said sleepily. Setting her down gently on her bed, he worked to get her settled in. After removing her shoes and socks, he grinned at seeing her surprising toenail colors again. He tenderly tucked her in, then leaned down for a chaste kiss on the lips. "Sweet dreams," he whispered before peeking under her bed and in her closet. He did a sweep of the entire house before letting himself out. He had to be certain that no one had taken advantage of the unlocked door. Once satisfied that the premises were safe, he left, pushing the button to automatically lock the front door behind him. Jim saw him safely home and confirmed that he would be there at the usual time to pick Trevor up for work in the morning. Trevor knew it would be a short night, since he was getting to bed so late, but he was too excited about tomorrow's announcements to sleep. Chapter 12. Millie helped him schedule an all-staff town hall meeting for mid-morning. He wanted to be the one to tell his employees about the massive deal they had just struck. It felt good to know that it was his wits and creativity that had finalized the official decision to award the mall contract to Donovan Enterprises. He stood before his empire, many of them watching via live video from their offices across the world, and proclaimed victory in one of the biggest nationwide deals in recent history. The employees in attendance in the building whooped with excitement when he showed the slide with the various mall locations they would be building and told them they would now be the place for everyone who was anyone to shop. It had been an intentional move to share the news with the employees before releasing the story to the press. He knew that by now the press had probably gotten a hold of it, but at least he had shared the news with his workers first. They had a right to know before anyone else. Trevor was fairly confident that his brother would agree with the protocol change when he came back. If he ever came back. Trey had seemed pretty cozy baking cupcakes. The elevator ride back to the top floor was crowded with people, all chattering excitedly. He caught Millie's eye and winked at her over the tops of several people's heads. She quickly looked away, but he didn't miss the sly smile that lit up her face. As they rode through the floors, the elevator stopped periodically, ejecting more and more people until it was just Trevor and Millie left heading up to the top floor. Their floor. He sidled up beside her and took a hold of her hand, both of them still facing forward, following basic elevator protocol. "There are cameras," Millie whispered out the side of her mouth, as if security would be able to read her lips. Before he had a chance to respond, the elevator doors slid open to relinquish them on the top floor. Millie yanked her hand away as if she had been burned, because there were several people in the waiting area. Her desk phone was ringing incessantly. When she started to scurry to answer it, Trevor saved her from it by asking, "Could I see you in my office, Miss Parks?" She halted in her tracks, and for a brief moment, her carefully measured composure dropped. She gave him a questioning look. He wasn't sure if it was due to his all-business tone of voice or his use of such a formal name for her. Quick as a wink, her face morphed into that of his competent, efficient assistant. "Of course, I'll be right in," she responded as she stopped by her desk to pick up a notepad and pen. Several well-wishers greeted Trevor as he made his way back to his office. He shook hands and spoke to them, but quickly moved on. It was fantastic to finally feel like he had earned the right to be in this office. Sure, Trey had started working on the deal, but Trevor had been the one to finish it. He wondered for a brief moment how Selena Chase had reacted to the news, but then he decided not to be petty. He had won, and she undoubtedly knew it. There was no reason to rub it in. Millie joined him in the office, shutting the door behind her and perching on the edge of a chair, ready to jot down notes. He rounded his desk, grabbed a binder, and walked to her. Gently taking her hand, he asked her to join him on the couch. "This is for you." He handed her the notebook. "Our employee handbook?" she asked him, obviously confused. "Everyone gets one of these when they start working here. I already have one." Comprehension dawned on her face then. "I know that I haven't kept our relationship on a strictly professional level, and I'm sorry for that. I'll do better going forward." He was touched that she was willing to take the blame for their improprieties. He had been the one doing most of the chasing. "Turn to page 56, please." Her crystal blue eyes searched his dark ones for a long moment, trying to figure out if she was in trouble. The fear that she was going to lose her job was unmistakable in her gaze. Wanting to assuage her concerns, he encouraged her to read Section 4, Part B. She read the wording aloud. Romantic or sexual relationships between employees where one individual has influence or control over the other's conditions of employment, even if consensual, may ultimately result in conflict or difficulties in the workplace. If such a relationship currently exists or develops, it must be disclosed. Disclosed? Her eyes were wide as she looked up at him. That used to say terminated. I looked it up, she admitted somewhat sheepishly. He felt a surge of happiness that she too had perused the employee handbook, searching for a loophole that would allow them to explore this relationship. It did used to say that, he confirmed before adding, "It turns out that it's pretty easy to change one little word in the handbook when you're the boss." Her face was alight with happiness, but he still wanted to be certain. "I thought maybe we could go out on a real date, but only if you're interested." He added the last part quickly. "I don't want to put any pressure on you, and I want to assure you that your job is not in jeopardy, no matter what happens." "Thank you for that reassurance." She smiled and locked eyes with him. "I would love to go on a date with you sometime." Trevor was certain he had never heard more glorious words. "How about tonight?" he asked, already excited to spend time getting to know her. "Tonight will work." She kept her tone light, but she was beaming from ear to ear. Her sky-blue eyes sparkling with a sudden idea, Millie got up and walked over to lock his office door. "In the meantime, is there anything in that manual about fooling around at work being a forbidden activity?" His throat was suddenly parched. He swallowed audibly, loving this new adventurous side of her that was beginning to shine through. "If there is, I'll change it," he promised her. He wasn't able to keep completely at bay the concern over the crowd of people waiting for him, though. As much as he hated to bring it up at this moment, he felt like he needed to say something before things got completely out of control. "There are a lot of people waiting out there." Millie stunned him by flipping off the rules for a brief moment. "They can wait. You're the boss," she reminded him. "That I am," he grinned, liking the sound of those words coming from her mouth. Sliding a hand slowly up her thigh, she raised her short skirt up enough to hook a thumb over her panties. Watching him, she lowered her underwear to the ground and stepped out of them. Using the toe of one expensive, dark gray pump, she flicked them through the air in his direction. He caught them in one hand and marveled at the tiny wisp of white lace. "You're full of surprises." His voice sounded gravelly. "We're just getting started," she hinted, and the promise of what was yet to come made his already uncomfortably firm member transform into rock hard and ready as it strained for release from his pants. She joined him on the couch, leaning back in silent invitation. He watched her trail one finger suggestively along the prim pearls at her neck. He longed to discover her secrets with his own hands, lips, and tongue. Unable to hold back any longer, he lunged in her direction and loved her until they both forgot everything else. How did Selena Chase react to losing the mall deal? Find out in the Billionaires.